Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Teddy. I'm a winter naturalist at the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, or ACES. If this is your first time at ACES, welcome. If it's not, then welcome back. Each winter, ACES partners with Wilderness Workshop and the Roaring Fork Audubon to co-host Naturalist Nights, a free winter speaker series featuring experts from across the country who explore different topics of the natural world and our community. We would like to thank, this is our last Naturalist Night of the season, and we thank you all for joining us. We would like to thank all of our amazing sponsors for tonight. Our gold sponsors are Reese Henry and Company, Ken Ransford. Our silver sponsors are Ute Mountaineer, Blazing Adventures, Bristol Cone Mountain Sports, Aspen Square, Two Leaves in a Bud, Aspen Snowmass, and Bonfire Coffee. These businesses provide financial and in-kind donations that make Naturalist Nights possible, including the cookies and tea that you are enjoying tonight. GrassRoots TV is live streaming tonight's presentation on their website, Wilderness Workshop, and ACES Facebook page, and our YouTube channel as well. A cleaned up recording will be made available on ACES and Wilderness Workshop's YouTube channel in the coming days. And now I am excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Evan Hjerpe. As a naturalist at ACES and someone who enjoys recreating in the outdoors, I am a frequent user of public lands. I've always been interested in how the multiple use mandates have historically been used to balance conservation, recreation, and economic development. And more recently, how agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service are adapting to novel environmental stressors under climate change, such as unprecedented drought, historic wildfires, and shifting distributions of animal and plant species, all of which pose threats not only to outdoor recreation, but also to regional and state economies. And now to talk about Evan a little bit. He is the founder and director of the Conservation Economics Institute, or CEI, a nonprofit research organization that aims to apply economics to sustainable management of natural resources. He holds a Ph.D. in forest economics and management from Northern Arizona University. His expertise includes conservation benefits, regional economics, public land policy, and recreation economics. Evan has consulted for private businesses, nonprofit organizations, federal agencies, and universities, and has also authored numerous journal articles and technical reports. Please remember to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, when we'll have a brief Q&A session. Thanks, and please welcome Evan Hjerpe.
Thank you, Teddy, for that great introduction. Thanks to all of you for making it out this evening. I guess there's a little bit of interest in the economics of public lands and protected areas. I want to thank Roaring Fork Audubon. I want to thank Aspen Center for Environmental Studies and Wilderness Workshop for hosting this Naturalist Night series. It's a wonderful public service for everybody, and I'm honored to be here tonight. This evening, I want to take you on a conservation economics journey, if you will, exploring public lands and protected areas through an economic lens. I want to provide a recent history of economic changes, restructuring, and transitions that are occurring in the American West related to our public lands and protected areas. And I hope to provide a compelling argument on why we need to prioritize the sustainability of our public lands now more than ever. I briefly want to give you a description of CEI. We are a network of environmental economists with a mission of applying economics to the sustainable management of our natural resources, the development of healthy communities, and the conservation of nature. We have an incredible team and network of economists, and we also have a very excellent board with Tom Holmes, John Loomis, Gwendolyn Aldrich, and Pete Morton. Pete Morton has been working on phased energy development for over 30 years on public lands and is a co-founder of CEI, and we're honored to have Dr. Pete Morton in the back of the room with us tonight. Thanks, Pete. I also want to say that our work is really building on numerous other researchers who laid the foundation for a lot of economic valuation of natural amenities. And one of these is John Crutilla, who in the 1960s and 70s really started to formalize the economic values of undisturbed natural environments. It really hadn't been done before in economics. And I want to read you a quote from his seminal paper in the American Economic Review Journal titled Conservation Reconsidered. This is in 1967. The quote is, "Natural environments will represent irreplaceable assets of appreciating value with the passage of time." So it's a quick quote, but the entire paper really captured some of these very novel economic concepts about undisturbed natural environments. It talked about the irreplaceability of these natural environments, talked about how degradation and development can be irreversible on our natural environments. And he really started opening up the ideas of passive use values. These are existence, option, and bequest values. And you can think about how most all of us want to bequeath natural amenities to our children and to our grandchildren. So John Crutilla was a real pioneer. We also have another pioneer who happens to be on CEI's board, and that's Dr. John Loomis. He's a retired professor from Colorado State University, and John Loomis has been prolific in his research of non-market valuation of public lands, on recreation and water economics. So we're very honored to have him on our board as well. So I want to start with a little bit of levity for all of us. This is kind of a spoof commercial about nature. Some of you may have seen this, came out a few years ago. It's from a group called Prescribed Nature. And I'll tie it back into some of the economic values of public lands, but let's hear what they have to say.
Do you find yourself longing for the apocalypse? I did. I was looking for a reason to live. Hi. Are you feeling tired, irritable, stressed out? Well, you might consider nature.
From the people that brought you Getting Outside comes prescription strength Nature, a non-harmful medication shown to relieve the crippling symptoms of modern life.
Nature's recommended for humans of all ages, and it's great for pets too.
Nature can reduce cynicism, meaninglessness, anal retentiveness, and murderous rage. In clinical studies, Nature is proven to decrease work-induced catatonia.
Caution. Nature may cause you to slow down, quit your job, or seriously consider what the you're doing with your life.
If you are overly cynical, jaded, or emotionally numb, you may need to increase your dose of Nature. Do you have trouble being even mildly uncomfortable? Nature may not be right for you. Side effects may include spontaneous euphoria, taking yourself less seriously, and being in a good mood for no apparent reason.
So ask your doctor if nature is right for you.
Well, that's kind of a spoof commercial here. It has presents some of the economic traits that are relevant to public lands and to protected areas. And one of these is that public lands and protected areas are common goods. So this means that they're typically open, accessible to all of us. Common goods can suffer from the tragedy of the commons, and the tragedy of the commons results is overuse of our natural lands and lack of regulation. So that has pros and cons with common goods. Public lands and protected areas include non-market values. Non-market values probably comprise the largest percentage of economic value of our public lands. Public lands and protected areas are primarily dependent on taxpayer funding. You'll see that for much of our recent history of public lands, resource extraction has been paving the way for our public lands, but recreation and conservation are dependent on taxpayer funding. And then overall, conservation, recreation are lacking in organized lobbyist and trade associations. Yes, there are numerous conservation organizations out there, but they are primarily playing defense and protecting what we have out there. And then when you look at the overall money in terms of lobbying, the overall money pales in comparison to major industries such as pharmaceuticals and such as the oil and gas industry. I want to give you a little backdrop on public lands. Sorry about the legend. You're not supposed to read this or decipher any of it. Just note that most of the public lands are in the American West, by far, in the American West and Alaska. When I'm talking about public lands, I am referring primarily to the federal lands that allow public access, and these are lands primarily managed by the U.S. Forest Service, by the Bureau of Land Management, by the National Park Service System, and by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're lucky to have a world-class national park system. We are lucky to have a world-class wilderness system. We are the envy of all other countries in the world for our protected areas system. And what started off in the 60s as what was often termed the land of no use has now really turned the corner, and we see the immense economic value that our protected area system brings to our country. On the right, you can see maps of, we have national monuments, wilderness areas, and national parks across the American West. One of the things I want you to look at are the numerous counties. We have 415 counties in the 11 western continental U.S. states. The gray counties are metropolitan areas with populations over 250,000 as of 2010. So they're the metro counties. All the other counties in white, there's 356 of them, are rural counties in the West. Some of these are connected close to metro areas, but I want you to remember these 356 rural counties of the West. And then I want to give you a quick timeline on our public lands. I want to show some of what I feel are the most important environmental laws and conservation acts and the laws governing our public lands. I haven't included every one of them, but starting in the late 1800s, we had the mining law of 1872, the Forest Service and National Forest System got its start in 1891, the National Park Service got its start in 1916. And then the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 removed the regulation of fossil fuel development on our public lands from the mining law. I want you to remember these two laws, the mining law and the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920. We're well over 100 years for the first one, but over 100 years for both of them, and they are still primarily governing our mining and oil and gas development on public lands. They're overdue for an update. When we go through the 20th century, in the middle there, basically our public lands are being used for timber production, for fossil fuel production, and for mineral production. When we get into the 60s and 70s, we start to see a flurry of environmental activities and environmental laws popping in, starting in 1960 with the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. I don't have that listed, but that codified multiple use as a mandate for the Forest Service, the Wilderness Act in 64, NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act of 69, was probably the most important environmental law, and it required the examination of environmental effects for all federal land management projects. I've included Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, that codified multiple use on the Bureau of Land Management lands. And then I've also included the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA. Maybe not everybody's familiar with this, but it was the greatest addition to our public lands. It doubled the Park Service lands, and these were all in Alaska. So now I want to pivot to talking about some of our recent research and how we've been approaching the economic valuation of public lands and protected areas. So in the 1960s and 70s, outdoor recreation really started to mature, and that made it necessary to come up with these multiple use mandates to go beyond resource extraction. And this was a result of an increase in population and leisure time and transportation advancements. And in the 1980s, it started to mature, and auto touring, hiking, camping, skiing, boating, fishing, and hunting were the most popular recreational activities. And then into the 2000s, some of the recent fastest growing activities include birding, photography, off-highway vehicle use, and mountain biking. In the 1980s, we also had another phenomena that started to really crop up, and this is termed amenity migration. Amenity migration is the movement of people to mostly rural areas for environmental and lifestyle reasons. People in Aspen might understand this concept a little bit. Increased migration levels almost universally result in increased economic growth indicators, increased employment, increased per capita income, increased output. This made amenity migration a very attractive rural development strategy. Amenity migrants typically included footloose entrepreneurs, retirees, and people willing to trade income for a higher quality of life. So these two factors, outdoor recreation and amenity migration, helped with a full restructuring of regional economics in the American West. This is a slide from Barbara Wagner in Montana, but we've looked at the data and it holds true for all Western states and particularly true for Intermountain West states such as Colorado. And what you can see in the 60s and 70s, we started to see a rapid expansion of service industries. And what we also started to see is a rapid constriction of mining, timber production, and agriculture. This has led to expansive service industries now in the Intermountain West, in the American West. And these service industries are not just all hotel jobs or restaurant jobs. They now comprise a lot of infilling service industries that are very high wage industries, and that includes medical, business services, IT, and information. So these infilling services are extremely important now to regional economies. So I want to share a couple of our research articles where we looked at amenity migration and protected areas in the West. There had been a lot of research on amenity migration in general in different parts of the world actually, and some of it in the American West where the phenomenon has been very pronounced. And we are building on the work here. There were a couple of Montana economists, Tom Power and Ray Rasker, who started showing case studies of people not following jobs, but following natural amenities and bringing their income, bringing their personal businesses with them. And with this research, there was a lack of kind of systematic area-wide research on this for the American West. So we saw a gap and we really wanted to look at the influence of protected areas in particular on Western amenity migration. So we compiled a very large data set for those 356 rural Western counties that I showed you earlier. And we compiled a dependent variable of average net migration rates from 1980 to 2010. And then we came up with numerous other explanatory variables or potential independent variables, such as natural amenities. This included climatic, geographic variables, included land cover. We also included designated natural amenities, that's what we termed it. These were the 6 protected areas that we thought were most prominent. That was wilderness, national monuments, national parks, wild and scenic rivers, wilderness study areas. And then we also looked at built amenities and social amenities. And then our results were pretty interesting. We found that warm winters and water area were driving much of this migration. That had been found in some other studies. But this idea that people, especially snowbirds and retirees, want a bit of a warmer winter. We found that wilderness areas and national monuments were statistically significant in affecting and influencing this amenity migration in the West. We found that Colorado and Nevada were the 2 state leaders. It started in the 1980s in California, and then shifted in the 1990s to Colorado, and Colorado blew up in the 1990s with amenity migration. A lot of you probably understand that. And then we found a negative association with counties with oil and gas dependency and with agriculture. These counties lost population throughout these decades or just stayed steady. So here's a heat map of these, the dependent variable. This is 3-decade average rates of net migration in these western counties. And you can see that the southern warmer areas have a little more in migration. You can see that central Colorado had quite a bit. Pickens County was kind of mild, but did increase quite a bit in the 1990s. And not every one of these was amenity migration. I want to show you one that was the result of a resource boom, and that is in the northeastern corner of Nevada. That's Elko County, and Elko County doubled in population in the 1980s due to a gold rush. So not every one of this is amenity migration, and made us want to look a little deeper at this. But this is a very telling figure, and all 6 types of our protected areas that we analyzed, every one of them had higher average migration rates than counties without that protected area type. And wilderness was the most dominant, averaging over 8% each decade in net migration. So a county that has a wilderness area, has wilderness in there. Counties without wilderness areas, they average 0 growth. Now, we had this great data set, so we wanted to do a little more research on it. And we know that the amenity migration included retirees, but it wasn't telling us the full picture of which areas are most amenity developed. So we came up with an index that included migration rates, plus housing costs, plus seasonal housing percentages. And this was based on a professor from Michigan Tech, Rochelle Winkler. She came up in her dissertation with a scale called the Destination Development Scale. And so we used this index of these 3 variables to look at which areas have been most amenity developed. And you can again see that central Colorado is leading the pack. California and the West coasts are as well, and then along the Continental Divide. And there were some interesting findings in our regression results when we measured the independent variables on this index. Instead of warm winters, it became cool summers that were the most important. So it kind of removed some of the retirees and looked more at people looking for forest cover, looking for cooler summers, and then of course skiing. So it had some differences, but it was a pretty interesting experiment for us to look at. Now I'll show you, maybe you're interested in these top 10 natural amenity developed rural western counties. 5 of them are in Colorado. Again, Pickens County didn't quite make it, but the others did. And so basically, economists and scientists, a lot of times we collect a whole lot of data, we crunch a whole lot of numbers, we run a lot of statistics on them, all to come up with findings that everybody pretty much already knew. So here you go. These are the top 10. Now, I could have done an entire presentation on this slide. The downside of too much rural amenity migration. Basically, there's too much economic demand for these wonderful areas located next to natural amenities. And that excessive demand changes the very characteristics that make a place attractive for migrants and tourists in the first place. And it can lead to habitat fragmentation, sprawl and congestion. It can put the cost of living through the roof. Housing affordability becomes a major issue. There's a hollowing out of income distribution. You have very high income earners, you have very low income earners. There's expansion of wildland urban interface, becomes more of a fire management problem, and then there can be conflict between long-term residents and new arrivals. So Aspen is obviously a poster child for excessive amenity development, as is all of Colorado. And with that, Colorado and Aspen are also being forced to try to become leaders in coming up with solutions to deal with the downsides of too much amenity development. An example would be Aspen's real estate transfer tax and shifting some of those, putting those funds towards affordable housing. But the reality is there are no silver bullets here. This is a very large problem. And our hope is that we can work on some solutions and improve the situation. And our hope is also that some of these other counties and regions that haven't gone down the road too far yet can look to other places and can implement smart planning to balance conservation and development. So a real quick epilogue to our research on recreation and amenity migration. We did most of this probably from 2017 to 2020. And of course, then the pandemic hit. And then what did we see? We saw a whole nother boom in outdoor recreation. We saw a whole nother boom in amenity migration. And in the 2010s, amenity migration had really flattened off quite a bit in Colorado and in the West. So it all got reignited. And both of these exacerbated the equity and access and social issues that are present in regions that are already excessively amenity developed. And then it opened the door to the next best places. Okay, real quick breather. So with this tremendous economic value coming from public lands and from protected areas, it would be easy to assume that funding for conservation on public lands would match its economic value. So we worked with a couple of conservation groups on investigating trends in federal land management budgets for the Forest Service, for the BLM, and for the Fish and Wildlife Service from 2010 to 2021. We looked at broad programs and classified funding based on these programs of protection and restoration, recreation, extraction, and grazing. We started out and we called these funding buckets. So each of these agencies produces an annual budget justification document. In that budget justification, they put forth what they are planning to ask Congress for appropriations, and then they show how much was enacted the year before. So we tracked all that, collected that data, and then we tried to allocate them to all these different funding buckets. When we started into this process, we thought, why hasn't this been done? I mean, why can't we just quickly look and see, hey, where's all our funding going and what are the trends on this? And then we started trying to do it and realized why it hadn't been done. It was very tedious. The budget justification documents were not transferable or comparable among agencies. They were often not even comparable from year to year within the same agency, and certainly not from administration to administration. But I'll just show a couple of our most interesting findings from this study, and most of it came from Forest Service funding. From 2010 to 2020, wildfire management for the Forest Service increased 60%, from $3 billion to almost $5 billion annually. This appears to have come at the detriment of all other major activities on Forest Service lands. We have in the red extraction and grazing. Those decreased just a little bit, but recreation funding and appropriations decreased 11% from 2010 to 2020, and funds for protection and restoration decreased a whopping 37% over this time. All appropriations were presented in real dollars in 2020. So this is a major decrease. We also looked at recreation. We saw that 11% decrease in Forest Service appropriations, but we looked at recreation in comparison or in relation to visitation. And what I want you to, these figures are a little small, but on the top line, we're tracking annual visitation for the Forest Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Service. You can see steady increases, and then you can start to see some of the pandemic booms. But what we did was we termed this gap between increasing increasing recreation and appropriations. So in 2010, every visit to Forest Service lands had about $4.50 of appropriations dedicated to that visit. By 2020, that had decreased to $3.30 for every visit to Forest Service lands. We are loving our public lands to death, and the funding is not keeping pace with it. We need funding for boots on the ground, for enforcement, for education, for awareness. And it's a real problem, and it's evident in all the agencies. So we've talked a little bit about these threats to the economic values of public lands. Loving them to death, a lack of funding to manage for conservation. Climate change is a massive and certain threat to our public lands, as is pollution and degradation from extractive industries. Excessive greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel development on our public lands, including local air pollution, volatile organic compounds, the pollution from hard rock mining in terms of acid mine drainage can continue for hundreds of years, if not even thousands of years. These are a problem because we have hundreds of thousands of abandoned hard rock mines, and we have millions of abandoned oil and gas wells. I also included invasives on here, and then the disposal of public lands. Living in Colorado, you might not think much about the disposal of public lands. If you live in Idaho, you live in Utah, you're constantly reminded of efforts to privatize and dispose of our public lands. So now I want to turn down the home stretch, and I want to focus on a flurry of research we did in just the last few years on some of this pollution and degradation from oil and gas on production on public lands and how it affects these economic values. The federal oil and gas leasing program is very inefficient and very outdated. Royalty rates, bonding, minimum lease bids, all of them are outdated and inadequate. Remember, much of our management for fossil fuel development, for hard rock mining, is still coming from laws from 1872 and from 1920. It makes no sense. Things have changed. All of it results in heavy subsidies to oil and gas producers, pollution, and a very poor return on investments for U.S. taxpayers. So there's a great need to reform the oil and gas leasing program. When we look at Colorado here, we have oil and gas production in the state of Colorado, and the trend line here is showing the federal market share of oil and of gas. What you can see for oil, 6% of Colorado oil production is currently coming from public lands, so pretty small percentage. It's a bit higher, about 27% for natural gas production. You can also see a rapid boom in Colorado oil production over the last decade and a steady increase in gas production in Colorado. In a report, we looked at federal leasing for oil and gas, and we looked at the number of non-producing federal acres that are under lease. These are speculative buys. These are purchases on our public lands, locking them up for oil and gas leasing that are often waiting for spikes in oil prices. We found over a million, not over a million, just under a million acres in 2020 of non-producing federal acres under lease. We estimated with some calculations that Colorado would have 35 years of future drilling opportunities on federal lands with no more leasing. And that includes some of the existing leases going on. So there's a lot of excess, there's a lot of bloat in the federal oil and gas leasing system. So finally, we want to talk a little bit about the energy and economic transition in Western Colorado and talking about the resource management plan that's ongoing in the Colorado River Valley Field Office and the Grand Junction Field Office. They are doing a supplemental EIS looking at whether or not some of these oil and gas acres that have been open for leasing should be closed down. They are looking at whether or not some areas should be designated as areas of critical environmental concern, and then whether or not they should stop leasing areas of no oil and gas potential, low and medium oil and gas potential. We focus on Garfield and Mesa counties because those two counties will be most affected by this supplemental EIS. This is the regional oil production for Garfield and Mesa County coming from the Piceance Basin. This trend line here is again showing the federal market share. So for oil production, you can see about 30% of the Piceance Basin production is coming from federal lands. You can see a major boom and rise to 2012, and then a steady decrease from 2012 to now. More importantly for the Piceance Basin is natural gas production. Again, the trend line for federal market share is a little higher for the gas. It's about 44% now. It's coming from public lands, but we see the same idea. Rapid shale boom from directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing increasing in the 2010s, peaking in 2012, steadily decreasing through multiple administrations to this point. We saw that the state of Colorado is increasing all of this oil and gas production and not decreasing. And so basically the Piceance Basin and these counties are losing a competitive edge to more economically feasible production in northeastern Colorado, particularly Weld and Adams County. Also of note, the entire employment levels for Garfield and Mesa County, only 2% of employment is for oil and gas activities. So it's already ramped down to a very small percentage of oil and gas employment. So in general, for an energy transition on public lands, a targeted focus for plugging orphaned and abandoned wells is a great job creation transition strategy. So in one of our reports, we looked at, there's a few estimates of how many orphaned and abandoned wells are in the US, but it's in the millions and we haven't even discovered all of them. So we looked at what would a job creation program of plugging 2.6 million abandoned oil and gas wells, what would that create? We found that would create 85,000 direct jobs for a duration of 10 years, and we found that it would reduce the emissions of 250,000 metric tons of methane. So another strategy would be aggressively capturing methane pollution from existing oil and gas production. This includes looking at leak detection and repair for operations, reducing the amount of flaring that's going on. This can be a win-win for both industry and the environment. You can get more market to gas, and you can reduce the amount of gas that is immediately emitted to the atmosphere. And then a third transition strategy would be to locate or co-locate, when possible, renewable energy projects near affected communities interested in diversifying their energy supply. So a couple of quick primary community considerations for rural energy transition. You need to look at the market effects first. If you're going to have a big transition in public lands energy, you need to understand how that's going to affect the overall employment levels in the region, how it's going to affect labor income, and how it will affect other supporting industries that help service oil and gas industries. So in the case of Western Colorado, the market effects, first of all, if they shut down some of the no potential, low potential, and medium potential leasing sites, if they shut them down, it won't have an effect on the existing leases. It won't have effect on the much larger private and state market shares, and the effect won't come for a number of years. Another important consideration is the revenue and how communities can replace and offset revenues. Oil and gas does bring in a lot of royalties and severance taxes into these communities, and Unfortunately, a lot of these communities have embedded these revenues into structures for funding their community schools and for funding a lot of their city programs. And that puts these communities in a bind if there's going to be a change in this. But we've also done quite a bit of research led by Pete Morton on examining the net fiscal impacts and costs of oil and gas. So typically you see, oh, all this revenue is brought back, but what's not calculated are the non-market values and the spillover pollution. Those aren't calculated into the problems. So you need to look at the overall costs of that. Resources for the Future has also looked at that. They did a case study with Rio Blanco and Garfield counties and showing two kind of dramatically different net fiscal costs from oil and gas there. And then finally, you have to look at the energy source and you have to see how reducing natural gas and coal for regional power affects community. How is it going to affect the local community utility payer? How can you offset these sources? Colorado still is running and powering a lot of communities with natural gas and coal. So how can you replace this with renewables? Okay, going to wrap it up here. For a public lands economic summary, we really need a fundamental shift away from making the land pay its way with resource extraction to a strategy of investing in our natural capital. We need a greater understanding of public lands and protected areas as natural assets to be sustained and maintained for current and future economic value. Progress only goes in one direction, and that means that we're going to have less habitat, more species extinction, and more degradation to our natural amenities and our public lands and our protected areas as we move forward. This increasing scarcity of nature makes natural areas more economically valuable over time as the supply of nature diminishes. And this increasing scarcity of nature also makes it imperative that we implement the most sustainable options for our public lands. I don't want to be depressing, but these are some real issues. And as a researcher that spends almost every day looking at these economic trends on our public lands and in our protected areas, it's very alarming. With that, we'll wrap it up and get to some questions.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions. When you ask them, please speak into the microphone. It goes into our live feed so that you can hear what you have to say.
Thank you for coming. Really enjoyed your talk. I just had a question. Curious if you studied the stickiness of the migration to amenity-rich areas during the pandemic, because it certainly felt like there was a little bit of a boomerang effect where maybe people came, they had their sojourn, and then they went back a few years later to wherever they came from. So I'm just curious about the stickiness or sort of the net numbers, and if you looked at that.
We're very interested to go back and look at that data. It's so fresh, and it was really interesting because we had COVID migrants. We had people who wanted to move for other reasons, and that gave them the perfect opportunity. We had some people, wealthy people, moving from the city that never even wanted to be in the country, but they said, hey, now's the time to go to a rural county. I suspect you're right that a lot of that wasn't super sticky, and a lot of them have already left, but it added a huge stress, and it was quite the boom. The other important thing is that you had a lot of people, a lot of investors using higher property values as equity, let's say in California, to go purchase places in areas with similar natural amenities but cheaper prices. That was Idaho. And that's kind of this natural amenity arbitrage where everything starts going and equaling out. Now Idaho's getting out of control. And we're really interested to go back because it's kind of, you know, we kind of solved it and then boom, it just happens again.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I recently, I think it was about a year ago, there was a proposal about leasing on public lands, and instead of as conservation as an option instead of extractive industry. Can you talk a little bit about what the status is on that, and if that's a solution that might be something that's viable for us?
That's part of the current administration's public lands rule that they're trying to roll out. And so the idea of conservation leasing would allow conservationists, others, to be able to get into this competitive game for oil and gas leasing. It's a very interesting concept that should be investigated more and more. It could have some adverse effects or unintended consequences that we haven't fully thought through, but in general, I think it's an option that should absolutely be on the table, and we should start looking more into it. But as with all things, we don't know exactly how it would play out, and so there is always a concern of just kind of, is this another way of putting our lands up to the highest bidders? You have to watch out for that. But absolutely, it should be investigated deeper.
So what can we do? I mean, what can we do? You are an expert, so you know what everything is involved, but we don't really know what you know. So, well, now what?
Well, what we can do in terms of citizen actions, for starters, keep commenting on these NEPA processes. Oftentimes it feels like we're just getting lip service or something, and that it might not matter, but I've seen cases where enough commenting can change a final decision. Bring the economics, bring the science into it, and keep pointing to that. And again, I've seen situations where they couldn't deny the economics of it. And so that's where we like to try to publish most of our research in academic journals. It gives it greater legal standing. We have to make sure all of our work is bulletproof, because it will be attacked from every side. And getting it out there is a huge issue. And so we try to do outreach and communication of our research. We work constantly with advocacy groups and with conservation organizations who are getting this research into the land management process. Sometimes you have local land managers that are very receptive. Sometimes their hands are pretty much tied. And then ultimately, the courts can help settle some of this, and using science in litigation can make it almost irrefutable and gives a judge no choice but to say, this is the science and we need to go this way.
To further answer that lady's question, one of the sponsors this evening is Wilderness Workshop. Please go online to Wilderness Workshop. Wilderness Workshop is dealing with so many of these issues. It's a local organization that needs your support.
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation today. My question has to do with, you spoke a lot to the recreational value of our land, and I've been reading more and more recently about the value of the ecosystem services, sequestering carbon, filtering water, and what they provide to our communities. Have you done any research into that in terms of like quantifying that and using that potentially as another line of argument of why we need to invest more into protecting these lands?
Yes. Comment and question. We absolutely have, and we usually blend in some of these into almost every report. Pete and others, we've been working quite a bit on looking at ecosystem service degradation from oil and gas leasing. We did a Forest Service GTR with a number of Forest Service folks, and we looked at the carbon sources and the water sources that wilderness provide. So much of these headwater water sources are in wilderness areas. And we do try to do a lot of that. It can be tough to monetize and quantify these ecosystem services because you have indirect ecosystem services, you have the final services, and then we're still, as a human population, it's not an ecosystem service or it's not a benefit from nature unless it's a benefit to humankind. So if it's just benefiting the bears, well, all right, but how's it benefiting us? We like to watch bears, okay. So it gets pretty complicated, but yes, that's a great avenue to investigate, and we have sections of that in many of our reports.
All right, we have a question from one of the viewers on the live stream, which is, why do we have to lease our lands in order to conserve them?
Conservation leasing question. It's a good question. We shouldn't be forced to, but sometimes under multiple use mandates, you have to balance all of these different uses and all of these different regional economic effects. And I like the question. I don't have a great answer for it. I would say in a perfect world, we shouldn't have to.
We have time for a few more questions. Should anyone have them?
In a prior question, you alluded to some of the complications around quantifying or qualifying certain aspects of your research. And I was curious if there's any particular variables or evaluations that you folks have thought about doing but maybe have hesitated to do so or might do so in the future, some things maybe on the horizon.
I hadn't even thought of that one. The short answer is yes. I guess I don't have many examples. Well, okay, sure, I can come up with some examples. There's a lot of, take for instance, the orphaned and abandoned wells. We don't have good data on that. There are still numerous ones that they haven't been properly tallied. It's difficult to get these answers and get this data collection done through a federal agency. So one of the biggest issues that we have is a lack of data to be able to actually quantify and say this. Even if we feel like this is causing us strong economic impact, we don't know. On the horizon, we have some extensions of looking at oil and gas leasing, looking at impact fees for making polluters pay for pollution. We do a lot of wildfire work and a lot of forest restoration work. So we have a whole slew of projects out there, but I would say probably some of the biggest problems revolve around just not being able to access or collect enough data on these issues. Back to the ecosystem services, quantifying pollution and spillover effects is very difficult because we have a lot of these that are now cross-boundary. They're not abiding by political boundaries, so there are a lot of those problems. And then often we also run into some political issues where so a lot of people just don't want to dig into this. We just did a recent report on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It's turning 60 this year, and we just did a report on looking at how are we going to change this. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund comes from offshore oil and gas production, and it's this kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we're taking oil and gas revenues to acquire federal lands that can be used for conservation and protection. And if we're gonna go ahead and do the offshore oil and gas production, well, we should be taking some of those revenues to offset and mitigate. But a lot of these situations get a little tricky, so we have to deal with a number of issues, but I would probably say a lack of accessible data is probably the biggest one.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. So if you have further questions for Evan, you can ask them afterwards. But that's going to conclude our presentation tonight. So thank you all for joining, and also our last Naturalist night of the season. So we look forward to seeing you next year. And with that, please, final round of applause for Evan here.